Hey everybody, Brian here. In recent videos I went into great detail on how my Logic Drums to Anything script works, and because it's sort of like a universal drum mapping language syntax, it takes some getting used to get fluent with that new language. So in these next videos I'm going to go into detail on how to actually do specific mappings from some library to another library so that you really see how this language works. Here in this case we're looking at Logic Drummer going to Get Good Drums. Okay, the first part of this fun journey is to set up the basic script data needed for the mapping to work. So here I am with this Logic Drums to Get Good Drums example script that I have, and I'm going to open that up in the editor and go through everything step by step here. The first thing to do is set up any CC control related data. This will vary from library to library. So here we have this CC ranges source. That's for the source library. In this case, that's Logic. And then there's a CC ranges target, and that's for the target library, in this case, Get Good Drums. So first, we'll talk about Logic. In the guide, I have a lot of information about Logic, as well as various drum libraries. And here is how Logic happens to use CC values to determine its levels of open and close for its hi-hats. So it uses these so-called articulation IDs sometimes. So if you've ever seen IDs attached to notes for hi-hat hits, that's what that's all about. And each articulation ID corresponds to some CC value. So that's what you're seeing here. Those same exact values. And then I've simply just put those directly into the CC ranges source. In other cases, Drummer might output other AIDs. You might see AIDs in the 10s, 20s, and 30s. And in my first video, I went into very great detail on what that's all about and what we have to do to overcome that. All my included scripts from Logic to some library handles this weird aspect of Logic, so no worries. But just so you're aware of what happens sometimes is an AID in the 10s or 20s or 30s will get remapped to some AID between 1 and 7 because that's what Logic Sampler uses in the end. And Drummer and Drum Kit Designer, those are just interfaces ultimately to Sampler, which only uses AIDs 1 through 7. That's why I've decided to use 7 levels as a baseline. And I'll talk about Get Good Drums. I also cover that in the guide. So I'll go down to Get Good Drums. And Get Good Drums uses 5 levels. It has 2 closed levels and then 3 open. And its closed levels seem to just be the tip articulations, not the edge. And so what you're seeing here is exactly what I have here in the script. It makes it convenient to figure out how to go from, say, 5 levels to 7. Because what we're doing is we're using 7 as a baseline so that when the source has an open level of, say, 1, 2, or 6, we know how to translate that to a target library. So in this case, we have 5 in Get Good Drums, and we're writing out 7 levels. So that means in some cases we can reuse a level. So I'm using the closed tip for both levels 2 and 3 for Get Good Drums. Because in Logic, levels 1 to 3, those tend to be closed-ish kind of sounds, and then 4 onward are open-ish. So that's why I just have 3 be the closed tip as well. And then 4 corresponds to open 1 as well as 5. And then level 6 is going to be open 2 in Get Good Drums. And then level 7 will be open 3 in Get Good Drums. So this is just one way to do it. There are a lot of ways to go about this kind of X number of levels to Y number of levels. And something else to mention since I'm talking about CC data. With Get Good Drums, if you open up the contact instance of it and then go to settings, you're probably going to see that the hi-hat CC number, by default, that's, I think, 66. It makes absolutely no sense because pretty much any drum library will have that set to 4, and then that's doubled as CC1 as well. So I like to set this as 4. But if you're dead set on using 66, then here under CC ranges target, you would set that to 66. But let's not be weird like Get Good Drums and just use 4. So that covers the CC data. The next thing to do is populate the source articulation list, which is this variable L. And so L in this case is for Logic samples. And if you look at a track that has Logic Drummer on it, and then create a MIDI part, and then zoom the vertical axis until you see the articulation names. Here you'll see where Logic is using. This is Logic's basic map. And if we open the drum kit instance here, and change this input mapping to GM plus mod wheel, it won't change those notes, it just changes the names. The mapping is the same. I just do that because it gives you a better indication of what the hi-hat samples are really all about. F #1, hi-hat tip, G #1, hi-hat shank, A #1, hi-hat edge. And if you count these out, you'll find that there are 27 samples. And so you can go one by one and just populate those notes and the note name. Here I have the ordering different. That's just because I wanted to group related kit pieces together. So I have kick, snare, and then hi-hat stuff, toms, rides, cymbals, and then etc. But these are exactly all the notes that are here. And here where the note names are, you could specify these as a number if you wanted to. For instance, you could write out 36. I think that's C1. So this will work with note names or note numbers. The next thing you can specify are so-called user notes. This isn't required. A script could even have that completely blank and it'll still work. But it's pretty useful because you can add notes that the source library doesn't have. So Logic doesn't have a snare, flam, ruff, or roll, but we can enter them here, and that way in our MIDI editing, we can add those notes just like any other note, as if these notes are part of the Logic articulation list. Also, you can add a ride choke. Logic doesn't have that. And China hits, splash hits, and their chokes as well as miscellaneous other symbols you might have that you want to map to a target library. So this is a useful way to add additional notes that can map to articulations in a target that the source library does not have. And you can specify unused notes if you know there are certain notes that are definitely unused, or you could just have these entries with empty strings like so, and then the script will figure out if there are any unused notes that can be applied. So there's some flexibility here, but I specified them as so. And with these snare related notes, even if our target library doesn't have a snare, flam, ruff, or roll sound, you'll see in a bit in the mapping how we can use a mapping parameter so that we'll use some MIDI trickery to generate these kind of sounds in the target. And with source articulations out of the way, we go on to the target articulation list, which is simply named T. So I'm going to open up Get Good Drums, and I have the Invasion MIDI preset. And I think sometimes this ride choke isn't assigned. I'm not sure if I assigned that to E3 myself or if it was already assigned. But here's how I have things in Get Good Drums. Every articulation has a note. And just a word of caution, I've noticed that if I change a preset and then I go back, the snare hit sometimes changes from a D0 to I think an E0. So Get Good Drums seems a little bit glitchy. I'm glad to hear they're moving away from their contact interface. So hopefully they get some of those glitches resolved. So this target list here, it's all these notes. So if we count the notes in Get Good Drums, there are 32, and here they are. And likewise with the source list, you can write out the note name or the note number. The script will handle both. Now we're ready to actually do the mapping itself, and we'll walk through that in detail. So first we start with the kicks. In Logic there are these kick 1, kick 2 articulations, and Get Good Drums is one kick hit. So this is a several to one mapping that I mentioned in the user guide. So that's straightforward enough. Any Logic kick is simply going to be mapped in Get Good Drums to that kick hit. Now with Snare, things get a little interesting because Get Good Drums is a pretty weird library. And one other weirdness with the library is the fact that it plays back a regular snare hit or a rim shot hit depending on the velocity. So the velocity is from 0 to 79, it'll play back a regular snare hit. And then from 80 to 127, it'll be a rim shot. This was confirmed by Get Good Drums. Now this is for the one kit wonder architect's kit. For other kits, these values might differ. So you might want to just write Get Good Drums to confirm, or just test it yourself, see at which velocity the rim shots start coming in. And so what this says is if there's a Logic snare edge or snare center, then play back Get Good Drums snare hit, but set the velocity between 0 and 79. And that velocity will be proportional. So if the Logic velocity is 0, here it'll be 0. If the velocity in Logic is 127, then it'll be 79. It'll max out. Now for the rim shots, similar situation. Any Logic rim shot kind of hit is going to get mapped to Get Good Drums snare hit, but the velocity is going to be set between 80 and 127. Again, that'll be proportional to the actual input note velocities. This guarantees that when you have a Logic edge or center hit, that it's not going to play as a rim shot. And likewise, if you have a Logic rim shot hit, it's not going to play back as some regular hit. It'll play back how it needs to. And then the stick kind of hits, Logic has a stair, stick, snare, side stick. In Get Good Drums, you have a snare cross stick. So both of these Logic samples will be mapped in Get Good Drums to that snare cross stick. And remember what I mentioned earlier about user-defined notes? And we have these snare, flam, ruff, and roll notes. Well, even though Get Good Drums doesn't have those kind of articulations, we can generate them in Get Good Drums using some MIDI trickery, as I like to call it. So that uses a parameter called flam, etc. And there are 3 options you can specify: flam, ruff, or roll. So the snare flam hit, it's going to play a flam in Get Good Drums using the snare hit. So it'll play a quick series of snare hits, giving it a flam kind of sound. Same thing with ruff. Ruff only differs in that instead of playing, say, 2 notes like a flam will do, it'll play 3. So same situation, and then same deal with the snare roll. And in the GUI, you can control some of that later. You can control the speed, and with the roll, you can control the velocity and timing variation to make it more human. And now moving on to what's always the trickiest part in any mapping, which is getting the hi-hats correct. So remember I showed you in Logic it has these HH tip, shank, and edge hits for at F#1, G#1, and A#1. So for Logic to work properly in a target library as far as its hi-hat, open control, this is what we need. I know it looks like black magic, and all the Logic to some other library scripts have this already set up. And the way this works is you figure out what does the target library have in terms of HH triggers. Well, Get Good Drums just has this HHCC trigger. So in each of these cases, we're specifying that same Get Good Drums trigger. That's the target note. And then this AID map is what's needed to deal with that Logic nonsense with making sure drummer AIDs are mapped correctly to actual sampler AIDs. So these are all similar. It's confusing at first, but let me walk you through an example and then it all makes sense. If there's a Logic HH tip and it has an articulation ID of 10, it's going to get to stay as an HH tip, but it's going to be given an AID of 1. That's what this syntax means. It says, what note in Logic should this note really be, and what should its articulation ID be? Now, if there's a HH tip that has an AID of 20, well, that's actually, in Logic Sampler, that's supposed to be an HH shank with an articulation of 1. So an HH tip with an AID of 20 is really, in Logic Sampler, an HH shank with an AID of 1. I know that's really weird, but hey, we're talking about Apple, what do you expect? And then similarly, if there's a HH tip with an AID of 30, well, that's actually an HH edge with an AID of 1. And so this is kind of an internal mapping, so that on the Logic side, everything is correct the way it needs to be. We have these AIDs from 1 to 7, no drummer weird AID nonsense. And then in each case, we're specifying CC number 4. That tells it which CC number to use for figuring out what kind of CC data to send to the target library. So for any given note, once it's been remapped to the real note that it's supposed to be, then the script looks at that AID and will send the CC data. So if a note has an AID of 3, then it's going to go to the CC targets, look at the entry 3, and know that it has to send a value between 39 and 50 to Get Good Drums. So that goes from Logic AIDs to CC data in the target library. And by the way, even if you had Logic hi-hat parts that did not have AIDs assigned, say they just had CC control data, well, those are going to work correctly as well, because in those cases, the script will see the CC data and know, okay, there's a value of 55. That is, even though there's no AID, let's call that AID 4 and send CC data off to Get Good Drums corresponding to this level 4. So hopefully that makes sense. That's how getting hi-hats from Logic to our target library works. And now here we have something a little different for this HH edge. And why am I doing this? Well, if you go back to the CC data for Get Good Drums, it's closed hits. When we have levels 1 and 2, they're only going to be these tip articulations, a tight tip and a closed tip. So the way this works is if there's a Logic HH edge and there's an AID of 1 or 2 in Logic, and remember that can either be a real AID or CC data that corresponds to level 1 or level 2, then in the case of those Logic edges, trigger in Get Good Drums an edge tight sample or an edge closed. Make sense? And then lastly, we have Logic's foot close articulation is going to the HH pedal in Get Good Drums. And Get Good Drums I'm not sure why it doesn't have a foot splash articulation, so I just chose some articulation to act as a foot splash. So a Logic foot splash and Get Good Drums will be the HH Open 2 sample, but you could choose whatever you want there. And then with toms, Logic has a tom low, tom mid, and a tom high, and those are doubled up across multiple notes in Logic. So I have Logic's tom low 1 and low 2 going to Get Good Drums tom 3, that's its lowest pitched hit. And then Logic's mid 1 and mid 2, those are mapping to tom 2 hit and Get Good Drums, which is the middle pitched hit and Get Good Drums. And then Logic's tom high 1 and high 2 will get mapped to Get Good Drums tom 1, which is the highest pitch tom in Get Good Drums. And then moving on to the ride hits, Logic's ride edge maps up well with the ride crash in Get Good Drums. The in and out hits in Logic, those both get mapped to the ride bow in Get Good Drums. Though if you wanted to here, you could just write out both ride in and out in one mapping. Anyway, we wouldn't need this, but I'll keep them separate for now. And then Logic's ride bell, that naturally gets mapped to the ride bell in Get Good Drums. And now choking. Choking is a pretty tricky topic sometimes. It really depends on the differences in how a source and target library handle choking. In this case, we have a Logic ride choke. Now remember, we invented that note. Logic doesn't natively have a ride choke hit, but here is our invented note here, which is a C-1 in this case. And so if you add a ride choke note in your Logic MIDI, then that's going to map to the ride choke note in Get Good Drums. And we have this parameter here called chokes, and this specifies the source notes that get choked when this kind of choke hit is made. In this case, we're specifying the ride edge in out and bell hits. And the set vel parameter, this is useful in libraries that have choke hits that act like one-shots. In Get Good Drums, when you play back a choke note right after a cymbal hit, you're going to hear both cymbal attacks. But if you set the velocity in Get Good Drums so that its choke note is less than 50 or so, then you don't hear that attack, and it sounds much more like a natural choke. This is optional, but I find that it gives a more realistic choke sound. And because Get Good Drums doesn't support Aftertouch, we don't specify anything here. But say it supported poly Aftertouch, then you would just amend this line as so, a colon followed by PT. Or if it supported channel Aftertouch, you would write out colon and AT. But Get Good Drums only supports a choke note, so that's what we do there. And then likewise with the other cymbal hit, so Logic's left crash will map to Get Good Drums crash main left hit. Logic's cymbal left choke, which in Logic it's called the crash left stop, but I've renamed Logic's notes this way. And then this cymbal left choke, that'll choke the cymbal left crash, right? This chokes this. And again, using the set velocity parameter that we just saw here, and you'll see that in all these subsequent cymbal lines here. And then likewise with Logic's right crash. Now because Get Good Drums has two right crash hits, I just decided to do a one to several mapping. So Logic's cymbal right and Get Good Drums will play back either as the main right hit or a wide right hit. Say you wanted one to be chosen 2 times more often than the other, well, you could put a colon followed by a 2. And that means this hit is going to be chosen 2 times more often than this hit. And I'll just put it back as it was. And likewise, Logic's right choke. Because the right crash can specify 2 types of hits and Get Good Drums, this also has to specify the corresponding choke notes and Get Good Drums. So a crash main right choke that matches up to the crash main right hit, and a crash wide right choke. And the script figures all this out automatically so that the right choke gets played for the right note that was mapped. And just a word on these kind of mappings, if you don't want to do that, if you don't want to take this approach of going from a one to several mapping, remember you can add a Logic note, because we have these user-defined notes, so you could use a cymbal other one crash and cymbal other one choke, right? So if you did that, you would get rid of these entries here, and then just make a new entry. Cymbal other one crash, and then you would just have similar entries. So this other one, you can make that be the crash wide right, and then similar for this cymbal other one choke. This other one choke, chokes other one crash. So we enter that here. So that's just an option. And you can always comment out things in the script. That way you can return to some ideas you had. So I'm just going to undo all that. Back to how we were. And then this is sort of just a mental note to myself that I could also go with this kind of approach. this forward slash followed by an asterisk, that starts the comment section. And then you end it with an asterisk followed by forward slash. So this won't have any impact on the code itself. And yet another way you can handle these kind of situations where a target library has additional articulations is you could also use AID switching. So how does that work? Well, we get rid of that entry in the target note, but now we enter an AID switch. Let's just say that'll be 3. Okay, so what does this mean? This means that if you have some cymbal right crash, which in Logic, it's an A2, you could just enter the MIDI. So here's A2. I'm going to right click on it, articulation, 3. Now the way the script will handle that is it'll say, okay, we see a cymbal right crash from Logic, but hey, look here, for the AID switch parameter, it says if there's an AID of 3, then the note we really want to send to get good drums is this crash wide right hit, not the crash main right hit. So this way the AID switch actually acts as a general articulation switcher. You could do this with any kind of note, define your own articulation IDs, and figure out how you want to use those AIDs to switch to articulations in a target library. But I'm going to undo that for now and just go back to how we were. It's just important to know how the various parameters can be used to help you come up with a mapping that makes sense for you. In this case, we're just having the Logic right crash target either the get good drums crash main right or crash wide right, and which one gets chosen will be random. And then here, when I was talking about cymbal other 1, I guess I should have chosen a different one, because actually what I'm doing here is using a user-defined cymbal note. So get good drums has this X cross hit. It doesn't sound similar enough to anything else here, so I'm just using a user-defined note from here. There's no choke involved, it's just this other 1 crash in Logic will trigger this X hats hit and get good drums. If I want to use the other 2 instead, well, just add that, just make that change. That way, if we do use this entry where cymbal other 1 is being used, it won't get overwritten by what we do here. So that's the mapping. Actually, I forgot one little thing. This isn't necessary. You could keep this untouched if you wanted to, or you can just specify the HH pedal close and splash notes, which remember from above in Get Good Drums, the HH pedal close is this HH pedal note, and we use HH open 2 for the splash. This is just so that the GUI will display these notes automatically in the section of the GUI where you can set up HH pedal close and splash detection. You really don't have to worry about any of the other stuff in the script. Those 3,000 lines or so, that's just so that everything works. This is the same for any script. This doesn't change from library to library. Every script uses the same basic code. The only thing that changes are all the stuff above this point. And we've already specified all that necessary data. So if all went well, we hit run script. And in the GUI, if you see show advanced stuff, that's an indicator that all went well. Another indicator is this message here, successfully validated source to target mapping. You'll know something went wrong if you had some kind of error. So if we had some symbol and a no name that's not allowed and hit run script. Now notice in the GUI, there's an error indicated and we don't see show advanced stuff. The error gives just a general overview, MIDI note syntax error, but the console output here tells you exactly what was the error. In this case, syntax error, entire articulation list, MIDI note, telling you that you entered something wrong there. So you correct the error, run script, now you're back in a successfully validated state. After I've set up a mapping, I like to do a series of tests that check that things are well in the map. And these tests often depend on specifics of the target library, the specific kinds of parameters we use to accomplish something, just to make sure all is working as it should. So here I have a series of hi-hat tests, and in this one we have Logic not using AIDs, but using CC control data. So we hit play, and then in the GUI, as long as you have show console output checked, you'll see a lot of information about what's going on, and you can confirm all is well. In a mapping, once you know all is well, just unclick that, because otherwise this constant display in the output takes up CPU resources, which might bog Logic down. And so what are we seeing here? We had 7 notes played back corresponding to 7 levels of HH closed openness, starting from fully closed, going to fully open. So we can validate that all was well there, because we'll see entries such like this, note on, where the CC value is being correctly identified to be associated with level 1 in the target library. And then the next note, that was associated with level 2, level 3, all the way up to the last note, which was level 7. And these entries regarding control changes, those are telling us how the logic CC data was translated into Get Good Drums. So a logic value of 99 became 94 in Get Good Drums, a 106 became 99 in Get Good Drums, and so on. And also you see the mapped note. So in Get Good Drums, all these logic hits were triggering the HHCC note, and that was for the logic tip. We could do the same thing with logic's shank and edge articulations. It'll be the exact same kind of output. Because Get Good Drums doesn't have separate HH controllers, all these tests are going to sound exactly the same, whereas Logic actually has different articulations for all these. What we're hearing now is the playback in Get Good Drums. So if we open up the script again, and now we see this logic articulation 44, which is F sharp, G sharp 1. Those are also being mapped to the correct levels in the target library. And likewise, if we did the test for the A sharp 1, the logic HH edge hits, we're going to have a similar result. Now we should see these entries, yep. So this articulation 46, note 46, that's A sharp 1. So once again, we're just seeing this process of those notes in Logic along with their CC values being translated over to Get Good Drums based on the particular level that the CC data corresponds to, be it 4, 5, or what have you. Now we can also check that everything is working in terms of getting Logic's AIDs to work correctly in a target library. So here's the kind of nonsense that you'll see with Logic drummer output, where you'll see AIDs in the 10s, sometimes 20s, 30s. So we hit play. Same exact output, but now we're seeing some additional information about what's going on. So we don't see anything regarding the translation of CC data because we didn't have CC data. We only had the Logic AIDs, but those AIDs are being handled correctly. When an A sharp 1 had an AID of 10, that became mapped to an AID of 4. CC data for that level was also sent over to Get Good Drums, and likewise with all these other hits. That's basically just confirming that this use of AID map is working. And then for the last of the hi-hat test, here I'm just using the Logic HH tip, shank, and edge articulations with assigned AIDs between 1 and 7. So this is what you might have if you had Logic MIDI that was manually edited to have these kind of AIDs where you weren't using drummer. In all these cases, the AIDs are 1 through 7. So if we hit play, in all these cases, the AIDs just stay the same. We see that in the output. So when we had an articulation 46, an A sharp 1 with an AID of 6, that just stayed a 6, and the correct CC data corresponding to that level was sent over to Get Good Drums. So that's a lot to digest, but the bottom line is we know everything is working as it should in terms of HH mappings. Now we can move on to some of the other tests to make sure that the Logic snares are playing back correctly. So these two are regular Logic hits, and a center and an edge, and then a rim shot, and then a rim shot edge. And this just confirms that all is well with these entries here. So we play that back. In Get Good Drums, we heard regular snare hits and rim shots. And if you wanted to see the output, just open up the script, and you'll see entries like these. This note requires setting velocity to map properly in the target library. Set velocity to 118. So that was a case of a Logic rim shot edge being sent to Get Good Drums as a snare hit, and with the needed velocity for that to be played back in Get Good Drums as a rim shot. We can test the flam, ruff, and roll generation that I mentioned. So this test simply validates that all is working well with these entries. So we'll hit play. And you see all is well there. You also see output telling you the details. So in this case, a source articulation of snare flam is triggering snare flam generation in the target library, and etc. for the other hits that we just heard. And then just confirming that the use of user-defined notes is working as needed. Remember, we use a user-defined note, playback a X cross hit, and get good drums. So that's playing back correctly. We see cymbal other 2 crash was mapped to X hats hit. And we're also using user-defined notes so that we can write out in the Logic MIDI a ride choke. That's what this C-1 is. So we have a ride hit here, and we play that back. And we see some entries about how that choking proceeded. We see the velocity was set. Remember I talked about how using velocities below 50 will make it so that you don't hear the attack on that choke note. And we see the generation and get good drums of the ride choke, which accomplishes the choking of that note. Though not as well as other target libraries. Get good drums is quite limited in its choking abilities, but this process is the same for any library. And by the way, because Get Good Drums doesn't use Probably Aftertouch, you wouldn't be able to choose Probably Aftertouch in these cases. Right here we have a choke note in Logic that's being translated to a Get Good Drums target choke note. If we chose target Probably Aftertouch, well, now nothing's going to happen. We just hear that cymbal played out in its full duration. Change that back to target choke note. We hear it choked. And then similar with the China user-defined note, we can also see that in the GUI. So here we're having the F1 China choking the E-1. And likewise with splash. In that case, our user note for the crash was F#-1 and the choke is A#-2. All was well there. And we can also test that automatic chick in splash detection is working. This is just some CC data I invented for CC number 4, the foot controller. And in the GUI, you just make sure, at first, this will be set to none. So under advanced stuff, you just set the HH pedal settings. Set that to both. And here we see the target note that'll be played back when a pedal close is detected and when a pedal splash is detected, HH open 2. So we hit play. Those pedal close notes are almost imperceivable, at least to my ears, and in some cases the change wasn't fast enough to detect a splash or close. But all was working. We can see output here when those close detections kicked in. But it's just, minus 30, minus 40 dB. So this is another strange thing about Get Good Drums. Its HH pedal close note is so faint. But the important thing is that functionality is working okay. And if you wanted to, you could make adjustments to make it less or more sensitive to detecting a chick or a splash. We're not quite done. Let's return to the hi-hats because there's something about the way Get Good Drums handles the transition from closed to open sounds that just quite doesn't seem right. Here we'll play back. Now, did you notice how it went from those 2 closed sounds, and then at this third AID level, it's already a very open kind of sound with nothing in between. You have that so we can do a little bit of trickery. So we're going to go back to the script, and I haven't changed anything here. I've just made some annotations. So what we can do is we can have it set so that an AID 3, or if there's CC data that corresponds to that level 3, then we're going to use AID or CC-based switching so that the edge close hit and Get Good Drums will be played for that level. And I find that sounds like a good compromise. It's not quite a fully closed sound. It's not that open, but it gives a better transition from these very closed kind of sounds to this open one sound. And the way we do that in the mapping is with this AID switch. So I'm going to uncomment this out. And now for a level 3, this HH edge close will be played when there's a Logic HH tip as the input. When there's an HH shank, same thing. That'll also trigger an HH edge close when it's the level 3. And then for the edge, remember we already had these entries for AIDs 1 and 2. So we're just gonna change this a bit. So now both levels 2 and 3 for the case of an edge articulation and Logic, those are going to play back both as HH edge close and Get Good Drums. The bottom line is all of these now will play back HH edge closed when the input corresponds to level 3. So I'm going to hit run script to take those changes in effect. Nothing catastrophic. Now let's play back. Notice that difference? Now instead of having that We have an intermediate sound between levels 2 and 4. Now we have kind of a slight close, slight open sound. We can also go to the case where we just have AIDs. That'll be easier to play back and see what's going on. So here we have a closed sound. That's level 1. Here's level 2. Here's level 3, which is going to be that edge closed sound, which is slightly open, and then the subsequent open sounds in Get Good Drums. I think you'll agree that's a better transition. That sounds smoother. If we look at the script output, you can also see what's going on. In the case of CC data, we'll see that for the case of level 3, we're doing CC bass articulation switching, which is resulting in the HH edge close being triggered in Get Good Drums. With the other levels, it was going to Get Good Drums HH CC, the CC trigger sample. For instance, level 2 going to HH CC, and with the right CC values being sent so that Get Good Drums will play what it needs to play based on that sample. It's just this level 3 that we're doing a little differently. And you can see analogously when we use actual AIDs, how on AID 3, when in the input note from Logic, and now we see when we had that Logic AID 3, that was mapped to the HH edge close hit. Likewise, if we had those weird Logic drummer AIDs, then this level 3 here, which is this one, this AID 12 for this Logic note F# 1. We'll see that gets handled properly. And here's that corresponding mapping where the AID 12 for that particular Logic articulation was mapped in Get Good Drums to this HH edge close hit. So now we have a complete mapping. I think this little bit of trickery we're doing here with AID switch, that's making it an improvement. So this mapping is done, and don't worry about these warnings. And we're being told that these HH articulations are not being mapped to, but in fact they are. It's just a little bit indirect. Because we're using the HHCC articulation in Get Good Drums, when that note is played in Get Good Drums with the corresponding CC data, Get Good Drums internally is playing back these kind of hits. Now with that done, we could take a Logic drummer part and bring that over to this track. And we don't have to convert this to MIDI or anything. This is the Logic drummer part as it was. And now it's going to play back and Get Good Drums through our mapping. So that was it. I know a lot was covered, and I know it's going to be a little confusing at first, but just trust me, once you've done a mapping on your own and confirm that it's working, you're going to find that this language starts to seep in pretty quickly, and you'll be fluent in no time mapping anything imaginable. So till next time.